Thank you so much, David, and thank you everyone for welcoming me once again to have an opportunity to speak to you on this wonderful sunny day. At least only if you're staying inside. If you're outside, it's sunny and freezing, but that's okay. Um, uh, the rendition of "What a Wonderful World" was absolutely majestic, and I want to thank the musicians for that rendition. And Janet, I can't possibly think of a better setting for Gibran and Rumi to be conversing with one another than in an old coffee shop drinking my magical drink, coffee. Um, and I'll actually say this, I had a dream of Gibran once, and lo and behold, we were sitting at a coffee shop somewhere in Europe, actually, as I remember it in the dream. So the planets are aligned for your imagination and the way that I think of it. Um, the Quran has one of the most powerful verses that affects me all the time, and in many ways actually guides me in my journey that I'm on, that I've been on for 30 something years now on this earth, and that is tell stories. God says, tell stories so that they might reflect. And scripture is ultimately all about telling stories um, in various ways. The Quran is not necessarily unique in among all the scriptures in its emphasis on storytelling. What always captivated me about the way that the Quran tells stories is that the stories are not necessarily linear. The only linear story that's told in the Quran is the story of Joseph, and it's only the prophet Joseph, and it's all contained in one chapter. But specifically, if I think of the chapter of Moses, first we meet Moses in the Quran when he's older and he's guiding the Israelites out of Egypt. And then we meet Moses later on in the Quran when he's a baby and he's just born, and his mother is trying to take care of him. And then the recurring events and incidents have different dialogues in different chapters of the Quran. And I've always felt that if we were to just take that type of storytelling and turn it into a movie, it would actually be one of the most groundbreaking movies in storytelling. Like I think of movies like Memento, or movies with like huge plot twists, where you think you are seeing something, and then towards the end of the movie, you've been seeing something completely different. Um, but ultimately, I think the big question is when God says, tell stories so that they might reflect, what stories are we encouraged to tell? And I discovered that answer personally when I approached my spiritual guide, Maulana Sheikh Hisham Qabbani, who actually resides in Michigan. I approached him maybe three years ago now, and I asked him, I said, I want to write a book or an article about the reality of Sufism. And I just want, to lay it out, all the metaphysics and the spirituality and all of that. And as spiritual guides usually do with their foresight, they're seeing into the future, he told me with a smile, he said, sure, go ahead. It'll be a good idea. It'll be a good work. Little did I know, when I started writing this entry, I was writing about my own story. I began writing about my life, and that eventually turned into this book, The Souq of Nostalgia, and you can see it backwards, unfortunately. The Souq of Nostalgia, A Childhood Between Rivers and Mountains. And it was, this is supposed to be a trilogy, and I've only managed to write the first part. But what I was doing is I was going back to the beginning when I was born, and living in Iraq 6 years of my life until the first Gulf War, and then moving to Jordan. And that's basically that first part. It just covers my childhood in Iraq and then in Jordan. And what I was doing is I was deciphering, I was excavating the sacred in every single moment of my childhood. And one of the things that I sort of, um, through the embodied practice of storytelling, what I discovered is we gain some tools in our lives, spiritual openings, spiritual understandings when we mature. And it's like those tools that we receive are a kind of a trust that we are given by reality, by oneness, by God. And the trust is, now can you take those tools and go back to who you were, your childhood, your early years, and decipher my presence with you during those moments, right? Um, and it's funny because we gain the tools that we didn't have when we were children, but ultimately I feel like storytelling is a process of thinking like a child, right? Of having the innocence of a child. Like that, song by Enigma. I'm not sure if you guys know it, Return to Innocence, which is like one of my favorite songs, right? It's all about, I was trying to think back about what made me happy in those early years in my childhood. And ultimately for me, because I was dealing also with, the trauma of war, how do I engage suffering and redemption? How do I find the redemption within the suffering? Not that suffering is a completely different process than redemption. They're actually married to one another, and they happen with at the same time. Dare I say, suffering is a body, and its spirit is redemption, and um, and all of that I was able to discover through storytelling. For me personally, also as someone who sort of went or underwent a spiritual rebirth later on in life, at about 18 years old, which is now I've lived 18 years of my life with a particular spiritual awareness, and then 18 years before that without any particular spiritual awareness. This book or this writing process made me realize that that's not actually true. I think one thing that we struggle with, especially people who go through spiritual rebirths or religious rebirth or whatever it is we tend to think of ourselves before moment zero, when we were spiritually born, to not have been sacred enough. And we want to forget that part of ourselves. And again, I think that those trusts that we are given of sacred storytelling, awareness, is to make us realize that every moment in our lives that preceded the moment when we found truth, or when we experienced truth, or when we tasted truth, was actually not only essential, it was quintessential to delivering us to that moment when we experienced reality. And for me, my journey with my spiritual guide, which is for me the ultimate story, has been one of coming to terms with who I am, right? And that's ultimately what storytelling is about. And I'm reminded of one of the greatest storytellers, William Shakespeare, where he says, "All the world's a stage, all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts." One man, one woman in his time plays many parts. And there is a technique in storytelling and in screenplay writing called breaking the fourth wall, where a character on the stage addresses the audience, which of course it's a fourth wall. You're breaking the fourth wall because the characters on stage are not supposed to know about the audience. But I feel like Shakespeare actually did something even greater than that, more majestic than that. He did something I like to call breaking the fifth wall. And in plays like The Tempest, A character in Shakespeare's play not only addresses the audience, but actually witnesses the spiritual sacred reality of theater itself. So he says, all these actors, as I foretold you, have vanished into air, into thin air, right? And the character talks about the theater itself. He says, and this globe theater is like, has, it's like we are such stuff as dreams are made on in our little life. Our life is rounded with a sleep, and all of these lines. And I think that's kind of the key to what storytelling can do for us, right? It allows us to witness our own story as a chapter in a larger story that's ongoing. That we are a character in somebody else's story. But if we can't figure out our own story, then we make it difficult of helping others figure out their stories as well. And like that kind of metaphor in airplanes when they tell you that if the oxygen gets low, make sure to put your mask on first before you put it on the person next to you. When you help yourself, I have the quote here by Joseph Campbell. We're not on our journey to save the world, but to save ourselves. And in doing that, you save the world. Because as David beautifully said, divinity is all that is. And that is one of the most intimate ways, even in monotheistic traditions, to experience God, which is to experience him as God is intimately present in the world. And so the part is indispensable, is inseparable from the whole. So the story of God, that divine drama of creation, is ultimately the gritty, mundane details of our everyday life, right? And so that's why I loved Janet's setting of the coffee shop, because when we think, even Muslims, when they think of Rumi or Gibran, we think of this transcendent figures beyond body, beyond, and just these abstract words and ideas. But Janet is bringing us back, and I'm thinking of the smell and the aroma of the coffee in that coffee shop kind of dancing around the conversation, right? And I'm imagining other people listening. Perhaps, I don't know, Virginia Woolf is sitting there and she's picking up on the conversation and she's writing. Perhaps Steinbeck is there, and we're just all witnessing this incredible reality unfolding. The last thing I want to say, Khalil Gibran has a beautiful statement actually about storytelling. He says, it has been said that next to hunger and thirst, our most basic human need is for storytelling. Because without storytelling, we cease to be humans. And we tell stories from everything beginning from our the tempo of our voice to the nervousness of our bodily actions. Everything we do is telling stories. But the last thing I wanted to say is the relationship, and again, this is from my personal experience, the relationship between memory and remembrance when it comes to storytelling. So one of the things that's really powerful for me when I was telling my story is this power of nostalgia. Nostalgia for a childhood that is half finished, as I like to think of my childhood, because it was in migration from one place to the next and one place to the next. And I miss certain places that I realized through the act of storytelling. We don't necessarily miss places as they are. We miss them as we remember them. And the greatest healing happens when you come to terms with the fact that that is okay. They don't have to exist physically anymore, because ultimately this was all about imagination to begin with. And we are, as Shakespeare says, we are such stuff as dreams are made on. We are ultimately spirits with bodies, not the other way around. And so remembrance in Sufism is ultimately about remembering, right? We do remembrance like you say Allah, 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 Allah over and over and over and over again. And what that's doing for you is that is helping you remember who you truly are. And who you truly are is that character that you're playing in the ultimate story, in the ultimate drama of oneness. You know, George Harrison, when John Lennon was killed, they asked George Harrison, what are your feelings? And he said, oh, you know, John, he took off one clothing and he put on another. And that's sort of exactly what Shakespeare is saying. We are actors. We are putting on costumes for a role, and then we are taking it off not for the end. We are taking it off to continue on to another chapter in the story. And if we're able to witness these transitions in every stage of our physical existence in this world, and really to decipher that sacred, how the sacred exists in every moment, specifically at those moments when we feel we weren't sacred, or when we feel there wasn't a sacred, then there is no euphoria that is as powerful as making those connections. And ultimately, I think Gibran and Rumi and Ibn Arabi and all the great minds and hearts in this universe have been placed in our way, if we are aware enough of them, to help us come to that realization. They help us on that path. And the big secret is we are all one. I mean, a part of us is Steinbeck, a part of us is George Lucas, a part of us is Joseph Campbell, a part of us is William Shakespeare and Khalil Gibran and Rumi. Is just there is so many great parts to each of us that how much of our life, what focus are we going to have in our life trying to connect with which parts? You know, a great part of my story in the past few years has been the Interfaith Center. And it's a great eye and mind and heart opener. So I always thank you for the opportunity to come and speak to you. And I hope everybody is doing well. Thank you very much.